Auctioneer found pocket watch in old tree, stood there, motionless. That was how the morning broke open for Dale Keller. Not with noise, not with anything dramatic, just a man on a cold Iowa hillside holding something in his palm that had no business still ticking. But we'll get to that. The Hendrickson farm sat off Route 30, 12 miles east of Nevada, in the kind of country that looks the same in every direction and still manages to feel like somewhere. Rolling terrain. Wind that had nowhere to be but everywhere at once. The oak shelter belts along the fence lines had shed their leaves 2 weeks back, and the branches stood black against a sky the color of old tin. Dale's Chevy Silverado had been the only vehicle on the gravel road since before sunrise. He was there because the Hendrickson estate had filed for bankruptcy settlement, and someone had to catalog what was left. That someone was always Dale. He was 56 years old and had been doing this for 32 years. He knew what a farm smelled like when it was dying, diesel and rust and something older underneath, like grief pressed into the soil. He knew how to walk a property without stepping on anything that mattered to the people who'd lost it. He knew how to do his job without making it worse. That was the whole skill, really. That was what people trusted him for. He started at the equipment barn. 2 John Deere tractors, a 7,200 corn planter, a grain auger with a seized motor, an old flatbed trailer with 2 flat tires. He photographed everything methodically, moving in a grid, writing condition notes on his clipboard in a tight, practiced hand. The 7,200 was worth something if the planter discs hadn't rusted through. He'd checked that before he left. He moved to the machine shed. A Chevy pickup from '89, bed half full of old fence posts, 2 grain bins in need of resealing, a stack of irrigation pipe that had been there long enough to grow into the earth. He documented all of it. By 10 o'clock, he had the outbuildings covered and most of the equipment logged. He was efficient. He always had been. The oak tree was behind the barn. He almost didn't walk that far. There was nothing of auction value back there. No equipment, no outbuildings, just an old fence line running toward the creek and a tree that had been on this land longer than any family that had ever farmed it. But Dale was thorough by nature and habit, and he wanted to see the property line for himself before he filed his survey notes. The tree was enormous. A bur oak, probably 100 years old, maybe more. Its trunk was 4 feet across at the base, and its bare canopy spread wide enough to shadow half the barnyard in summer. About 6 feet up, on the south side, there was a wound in the trunk where a major limb had torn away in some past storm, decades ago, judging by how the bark had healed around the edges. The wound had hollowed out over the years. A cavity the size of a large mailbox, dark inside, packed with decayed wood and old nesting material. Dale set his clipboard against the base of the tree. He found footing on a root and pulled himself up to look inside. His right hand went in first. His fingers found something solid. He pulled it out carefully, thinking maybe a rusted hinge, a bolt, something metal that had been cached up here by some kid 30 years back. But it wasn't any of that. It was a pocket watch. Gold, or gold-plated, the metal warm-toned even in the flat morning light. Round, about the size of a silver dollar, with a short chain still threaded through the bow at the top. The crystal face was intact, clouded with a thin layer of condensation from inside the case, but still transparent. Beneath it, the hands were moving. Dale climbed down. He stood with the watch in his open palm and looked at it for a long time. The second hand swept its circuit. The minute hand pointed to somewhere between 9 and 10. The watch was running. It had been in that tree through 5 winters, through ice storms and spring floods, and summer heat that cracked the clay in the lower fields. It had sat in a hollow oak while the land around it changed hands, while equipment was removed and fences went unmaintained, and the county assessor updated his records. And it had kept running. Dale turned it over. He found the release for the caseback and pressed it. Inside, engraved in the yellow metal in letters worn but readable. To Marcus, from Grandpa Joe, 1978. He knew those names. He didn't move, didn't write anything down, didn't walk back to the truck. He stood beneath the oak tree with the watch ticking in his hand and let the weight of it settle into him. 5 years ago, this had been the Hobbs farm. Joseph Hobbs, Joe, had owned it for 42 years. 800 acres of Story County bottomland, 3 generations of the same family, a house that had been rebuilt twice but always on the same foundation. Dale had conducted the auction. He'd stood right here, more or less, and called the prices while Joe Hobbs's family watched from the edge of the yard. He remembered the grandmother, Irene, standing at the fence with her hands folded in front of her, watching her life be sold in lots. He remembered Marcus, the grandson, loading the last of his personal belongings into his truck without saying a word to anyone. He remembered thinking that the foreclosure had moved fast, faster than most. He remembered cashing the commission check. He had not asked questions then. He had not asked because the paperwork was in order, and because the paperwork being in order was all he required, and because he had been afraid that asking would cost him the neutrality that kept him employed. Now he stood in the cold with a watch that should have stopped years ago, a watch that had been hidden deliberately, placed where it might be found by someone willing to look carefully enough. His hand closed around it. Above him, the oak branches crackled in a gust off the north field. The sound went through him like a question he didn't want to answer. He put the watch in his coat pocket. He picked up his clipboard. He did not write anything in his notes about the tree. The drive back to Nevada took 20 minutes. Dale didn't turn on the radio. He kept his right hand on the wheel and his left hand in his coat pocket, fingers resting against the watch case without gripping it. It ticked against his knuckles the whole way. He wasn't sure why that mattered to him, but it did, knowing it was still running, knowing it hadn't stopped. He parked on 3rd Street behind the farm supply store and climbed the outside stairs to his office. The office was a single room above the loading dock, 12 by 14, with a window that faced the grain elevators and a baseboard heater that worked when it felt like it. 2 filing cabinets, a desk, a folding chair for the occasional client. 32 years of auction photographs on the walls. Equipment, land parcels, barns, farmsteads, the whole slow inventory of Story County changing hands. Dale had been present for most of it. He had documented all of it. He set his clipboard on the desk and hung up his coat. The watch he placed on the blotter, face up. He stood there a moment looking at it. Then he turned to the filing cabinets. The Hobbs file was in the second drawer, right side, under H. He pulled it and set it on the desk beside the watch. It was a thick file, thicker than most because Joe Hobbs had contested the foreclosure, and every letter and counterfiling and legal notice had been photocopied and kept. Dale had learned early that paper was his protection. If anyone ever questioned how he'd handled an auction, the paper was what cleared him. He opened the file. Joseph Allen Hobbs. Date of original loan, March 1985. Institution, First Agricultural Bank of Story County. Purpose, irrigation system improvements, secondary equipment purchase. 812 acres. Appraised value at time of loan, $940,000. Loan amount, $180,000. Repayment history, 35 years of on-time payments, not a single notice of delinquency until March 2020. Then, in March 2020, a letter from the bank's senior lending division. Formal notice of loan review. Grounds cited. Alleged use of property as secondary collateral for an outside debt instrument in violation of original loan terms. Request for full documentation of all property liens within 30 days. Dale read it twice. He'd read it before, 5 years ago, when the file first crossed his desk. He'd read it and thought, the paperwork is in order. Someone at the bank found a violation. These things happen. He'd thought that because it was easier to think that. He flipped through the subsequent pages. Joe's response, filed through a Nevada attorney named Carver. A denial of the violation claim. Documentation showing no secondary liens had ever been placed on the property. 3 months of back-and-forth correspondence, each letter from the bank more procedural and final than the last. A court date. Legal fees billed at $400 per hour. Dale counted the invoices, totaling $31,200. Joe had lost. Foreclosure finalized September 2020. Auction conducted October 2020. Dale found his own auction report clipped at the back of the file. He recognized his handwriting. Equipment inventory, lot values, final sale prices. The property had gone to a land development company registered in Des Moines called Prairie Capital Holdings, LLC. Final price, $1,215,000. He remembered that number. He remembered thinking it was low. He'd estimated comparable land in Story County at $1.75 to $1.9 million for property in that condition. But auctions were auctions. You got what the room gave you. Prairie Capital had been the most aggressive bidder, and they'd taken it. He remembered Ernest Kramer standing near the back of the crowd that day. Retired from the bank by then, 6 months out. He'd nodded at Dale when the final price was called. Dale had nodded back. He sat down in his desk chair and looked out the window at the grain elevators. The sky had clouded over since morning. It would snow before dark. He picked up the telephone receiver and dialed information. Asked for a number in Missouri. Marcus Hobbs, Kansas City area. They gave him 2 listings. He tried the first one and got a woman who'd never heard of Marcus Hobbs. He tried the second. 4 rings. Then a careful voice. Yeah? Marcus Hobbs? A pause. Who's asking? Dale Keller. I'm an auctioneer out of Nevada, Iowa, Story County. I conducted the auction on your family's property in 2020. He stopped. There was no good way to say the next part. I was out at the Hendrickson farm this morning, the property that adjoins what used to be your grandfather's land. I found something I think belongs to your family. Silence on the line, long enough that Dale checked to see if the call had dropped. What did you find? Marcus said. A pocket watch, gold case. Inside, it's engraved, to Marcus, from Grandpa Joe, 1978. The silence that followed was different from the first one. Dale couldn't have said exactly how, but it was different, heavier. Where did you find it? Marcus said finally. Hollow in an old oak tree, behind the barn on the east side of the property. It was still running? Dale looked at the watch on his blotter. The second hand moved. Yes. Marcus didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed register. Not emotional exactly, but something underneath it that hadn't been there before. My grandfather put it there, the day we left. He wanted me to have it, but he said he didn't want anyone to be able to take it. He said if someone found it someday, the right kind of person would know what it meant. Dale waited. He said maybe the truth would come out eventually. That's why he hid it where he did. He said an oak tree outlasts a lot of things. Dale looked at the file spread across his desk. The 35 years of payment records. The suddenly urgent letter from the bank. The legal fees Joe Hobbs couldn't afford to keep paying. Marcus, he said, what happened to your grandfather's farm? The real story. A long breath came through the receiver. How much time do you have? Marcus said. Marcus talked for 40 minutes. Dale didn't interrupt. He held the receiver with one hand, and with the other he wrote notes on a legal pad in the same tight handwriting he used for equipment inventories. He wrote quickly and without looking down at the page. He kept his eyes on the grain elevators through the window, on the sky going gray behind them, on nothing in particular. Ernest Kramer had spent 31 years at First Agricultural Bank of Story County, rising from loan officer to branch manager to senior vice president of agricultural lending. He knew every farm family in the county by name. He knew their loan histories, their soil types, their equipment debts, which years had broken them and which years had saved them. He was the kind of man who gave the eulogy at farmers' funerals and meant every word. And somehow, that made it worse. The fact that Kramer understood exactly what he was taking. In early 2019, Kramer began planning his retirement project. He was 65. He had money saved, connections in Des Moines development circles, and an idea. A residential subdivision on prime Story County land, close enough to Ames to attract commuters, far enough out to sell the rural lifestyle. He needed the right parcel. He spent months studying county maps and assessment records. He settled on the Hobbs farm, 800 acres, good road access off Route 30, gently rolling terrain. And the loan on the property was federally backed, still on the books, held by the very bank where Kramer had spent 3 decades. He drove out to see Joe Hobbs in April 2019. Marcus didn't know everything that was said at that meeting, but the substance was this. Kramer made a fair offer. Not generous, but fair. Joe thanked him and said the farm wasn't for sale. Kramer asked if he'd heard right. Joe said he had. Kramer told Joe to think it over. Joe said there was nothing to think over. The farm had been in his family since 1962, and he intended for it to stay that way. Kramer left. 6 months later, the letter arrived from the bank. The mechanism was not complicated. Kramer identified a clause in Joe's original 1985 loan agreement that prohibited the use of the mortgaged property as collateral for any secondary debt instrument. The clause was standard language, and in 35 years, Joe Hobbs had never violated it. But Kramer needed a violation. He went to Patricia Graves. Patricia was 44 years old, recently divorced, behind on her own mortgage, and terrified of losing her job in a rural county where bank positions didn't come available often. Kramer told her what he needed. Documentation showing that Joe Hobbs had placed a secondary lien on the farm property through a private lending agreement. The documentation didn't exist. Patricia would be confirming something that wasn't there. Kramer gave her $50,000 in cash. He told her it was a business arrangement. He told her that Joe Hobbs was an old man who wasn't going to be farming much longer anyway, and that the land would be better used developing housing for young families. He told her she was not doing anything wrong, just facilitating a transition that would benefit the community. Patricia signed the form. The loan review letter went out in March 2020. Joe retained the attorney in Nevada and began fighting it. But the paperwork was in order. The internal bank records showed a loan officer had confirmed the violation, and the confirmation carried the weight of institutional authority. Joe's attorney couldn't subpoena a document that didn't exist. The legal process moved forward. Joe Hobbs spent $31,000 fighting it. He lost in 6 months. Dale's pen stopped. He looked down at the legal pad. His handwriting covered most of a page. Numbers, names, a rough timeline. He could feel the shape of it now, the whole sequence of decisions that had run through the legal system and come out looking like paperwork. "Do you have proof?" he said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather kept journals. He wrote down everything Kramer said at that first meeting. He wrote down the dates of every letter. And my mother has something she's kept for 10 years without fully understanding what it was." Patricia Graves sent her a letter of resignation. Not from the bank, from herself, I suppose. She wrote to my grandmother after my grandfather died. She said she was sorry. She didn't admit anything specific, but she said she was sorry and that she hoped my grandmother found peace. "Your mother kept that letter." "My grandfather told her to. He said, 'Keep this letter. Someday someone will want to know it exists.'" Dale looked at the watch on his blotter. He thought about what would follow from the next sentence. A call to the state attorney general's office. Investigators. A federal angle, because the loan had been federally backed. Questions about the auction. Who conducted it? What they knew. Whether they should have noticed anything irregular. His commission on the sale? 4% of $1,215,000, $48,600. The question that an investigator would ask sooner or later was the same question Dale had been refusing to ask himself for 5 years. Did you know? The honest answer was, not exactly. He'd noticed the speed. He'd thought the final price was low. He'd seen Kramer in the crowd and thought nothing of it. He hadn't asked because he hadn't wanted to know, and not wanting to know was its own kind of answer. "Marcus," Dale said, "I need to think about something. I'll call you back." "Mr. Keller," Marcus's voice was level, not angry, just clear. "My grandfather died 3 years ago. My grandmother is in assisted living in Ames. She gets $400 a month from Social Security, and she buys her own toilet paper because she doesn't want to ask Marcus for money. A beat. That watch ran for 5 years in a hollow tree waiting for someone to pick it up. My grandfather believed the right person would find it. Dale didn't say anything. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Marcus said. "I just wanted you to know what you found." The line went quiet. Dale set the receiver down slowly. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. Light, dry flakes that disappeared the moment they touched the street. The grain elevators went gray behind it. The whole town went quiet in the way towns do when the first snow comes. That particular held-breath silence before winter settles in for good. Dale sat at his desk for a long time. The watch ticked beside his hand. He didn't pick it up. He put the watch in the top drawer of his desk. Not in a box, not wrapped in anything. Just in the drawer, face up, alongside a spare pen and a roll of masking tape and a pocket knife he'd carried since his father gave it to him in 1987. He closed the drawer and went home. He ate dinner. He went to bed. He lay there for 2 hours looking at the ceiling, and then he slept. In the morning, he drove to Ames to look at a hay baler that needed cataloging for a private sale. He did his job. He came home. He ate. He slept. He did this for 2 weeks. The auctions that month were unremarkable. A retirement sale in Huxley, good equipment, family that had made their decisions on their own terms, nobody in the yard crying. A partial dispersal in Gilbert, a couple selling off half their herd to carry them through another year. Dale worked each one with the same efficiency he always brought. He called prices, logged bids, shook hands, filed reports. He was professional. He was fair. He was the same man everyone in Story County had been calling for 30 years when they needed the thing done right. At night, in his house on 8th Street, he sat at the kitchen table and thought. He thought about reputation, what it was made of, how long it took to build, how quickly one investigation could reframe every auction he'd ever conducted. He thought about the questions an investigator would ask and the answers he'd have to give, and the look on people's faces when they heard those answers. He thought about what it meant to accuse a man like Kramer, a man who had given the eulogy at 4 farmers' funerals, whose name was on the donor wall at the county hospital, who had coached Little League in the late 1980s and still got thanked for it. He thought, maybe the evidence isn't enough. Maybe Patricia Graves would deny the letter. Maybe Kramer's attorneys would bury everything in procedure and counterclaims, and it would drag through the courts for years while Dale's name sat in the middle of it, attached to the word allegation, and that word would follow him to every auction he ever called. He thought, I'm 60 years old in 4 years. I have enough saved to retire modestly if nothing goes wrong. If I do this, something goes wrong. These were the arguments he made to himself at the kitchen table while the baseboard heater clicked and the neighborhood went dark outside the window. They were good arguments. He knew they were also, underneath, a single argument dressed in different clothes. He was afraid. On the 14th day, he drove to Ames. He hadn't told anyone he was going. He hadn't called ahead. He found the Meadowbrook Assisted Living Facility on the east side of the city without much trouble. A low brick building set back from the road, a small parking lot, a sign with changeable letters that currently read, Welcome Families. Visiting hours, 9 to 7. He parked the Silverado and sat in it for a few minutes. He went inside. The woman at the front desk directed him to the common room. He found Irene Hobbs in a chair by the window, watching a bird feeder mounted on a post in the courtyard outside. She was small. Smaller than he remembered from the auction, when she'd been standing at the fence with her hands folded, watching. Age had compressed her. Her hair was fine and white, and her hands, resting in her lap, were spotted and thin. But her eyes, when she finally turned to look at him, were the same. Clear and steady and carrying something that hadn't diminished. She didn't recognize him at first. He told her his name. Told her he'd conducted the auction on the farm in 2020. Something moved through her face. Not anger. She was past anger, or had put it somewhere he couldn't see. What he saw was older than anger, a grief that had been lived with long enough to become ordinary, the way a scar stops hurting and just becomes part of the skin. "Sit down," she said. He sat in the chair across from her. They talked for 40 minutes. Irene did most of it. She talked about the farm the way people talk about a person who has died, in the present tense sometimes, catching herself, then correcting back to the past. She talked about the kitchen garden she'd kept for 40 years along the south side of the house, the tomatoes and pole beans and the butternut squash that had spread further every year. She asked if he knew whether the people who'd bought the land had kept the old windbreak along the east fence line. Dale said he wasn't sure. She nodded as though she'd expected that answer. She said she hoped someone was enjoying the land. She said it plainly, without irony, without bitterness. She meant it. That was what broke something in Dale. Not the grief he'd expected, not the accusation he perhaps deserved, but the genuine hope that the land was being used well by whoever had taken it. After everything that had been done to her, she was hoping the land was all right. Dale's mouth opened. He closed his mouth. He said he'd been thinking of her. He said he was sorry about her circumstances. He said he hoped Marcus was able to visit soon. Irene patted his hand. She thanked him for coming. She said it was kind of him to think of her. He drove home in the early dark, the highway wet from afternoon snow that had turned to slush. The Silverado's heater worked better than the one in his office. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and the knowledge of what he'd just done sitting in his chest like a stone. By the time he reached Nevada, he had decided. He would take the watch to a jeweler in Ames and have it cleaned and repaired. He would write a short note, unsigned, no return address. He would mail it to Marcus in Missouri, and that would be the end of it. Marcus could do what he wanted with the watch, with the journals, with the resignation letter. It wasn't Dale's story to tell. He was the auctioneer. He was the neutral third party. That was what he was for. He parked in front of his house and sat in the truck. The decision felt clean and reasonable and responsible. It felt like wisdom. He knew, with the particular clarity that comes at night in a parked truck in an empty street, that he was lying to himself. He knew it completely. He sat with it for a long time. Then he went inside and put the kettle on, because there was nothing else to do. The jeweler's name was Harmon. He worked out of a narrow shop on Main Street in Ames, between a tax preparation office and a place that sold used furniture. Dale had been there once before, years ago, to have his father's pocket knife rehandled. Harmon was a small man in his 70s who wore a magnifying loupe on a band around his head and spoke very little, which Dale appreciated. Dale set the watch on the glass counter and explained what he knew about it. Gold-plated case, likely manufactured in the 1960s or early 70s, had been stored in an outdoor hollow for an indeterminate number of years, somehow still running on arrival. Harmon picked it up without a word, opened the case back, held it under the counter lamp, turned it over twice. He set it down and wrote a number on a slip of paper. Dale looked at the number. It was reasonable. "Week," Harmon said. Dale left it there. The week passed the way the previous two had. Auctions, drives, property surveys, the regular work of a county that never stopped changing hands. On Friday, he picked up the watch. Harmon had done the work carefully. The case had been polished to a soft, even luster, not aggressive, not the harsh shine of new metal, but warm and settled, the way old gold looks when it's been treated with respect. The crystal face was clear. The mechanism had been cleaned, oiled, regulated. Harmon wound it in front of him and set it on the counter, and they both watched it for a moment. The second hand moved smoothly, without hesitation. "Good movement," Harmon said. "Somebody built this to last." Dale paid and drove home. That evening he sat at the kitchen table with the watch in the felt box Harmon had provided, a sheet of paper, and a pen. He wrote the note slowly, thinking about each word. "Your grandfather's watch, found on the property where your family farmed. It was still running. A friend." He found a padded envelope in the drawer beside the refrigerator. He wrote Marcus's address in Missouri. He did not write a return address. He set the envelope on the table beside the note and the watch and looked at all three of them together. Tomorrow, he would mail it. The telephone rang. He didn't move for the first ring. On the second, he got up and answered it. "Dale Keller?" A woman's voice, older, careful, as though she had rehearsed the first sentence several times before dialing. "Speaking." "My name is Patricia Graves. I don't know if you know who I am." Dale stood very still. "I know who you are," he said. A long breath. "I'm calling because I don't entirely know why I'm calling. I've been trying to call for a week. I've picked up the phone and put it back down probably 8 or 10 times. A pause. "Ernest Kramer was hit by a truck on Wednesday. He was crossing Clark Street in Nevada, downtown, middle of the afternoon. The driver ran a light. Ernest is at Mary Greeley in Ames. They're saying he won't walk again." Dale said nothing. "He's alive," Patricia continued. "He's stable. But he's 70 years old and paralyzed from the waist down, and the doctors are saying he'll need full-time care for the rest of his life." Another pause. "I thought you should know. I don't know why I thought that specifically. I've been thinking about the Hobbs family. I've been thinking about them for 10 years. And when I heard about Ernest, I don't know what I thought." "Patricia," Dale kept his voice level. "Why are you calling me and not someone else?" The silence lasted long enough that he thought she might hang up. "Because you're the one who conducted the auction," she said finally. "Because you were there. Because I thought maybe you'd notice something. That maybe I wasn't the only one who'd been carrying this." Her voice was not quite steady. "I've been in therapy for 9 years, Mr. Keller. I've talked about this every week for 9 years. I sent Irene Hobbs a letter after Joe died because I couldn't carry it anymore without doing something. I couldn't tell her the truth because I was afraid, but I had to say something." A breath. "I'm so tired of being afraid of it." Dale looked at the padded envelope on the table. He thought about Kramer in a hospital bed in Ames, paralyzed. He thought about what it meant that Kramer had been struck down, whether it was justice or just weather, just the randomness of a driver running a light on a Wednesday afternoon. He thought about how easy it would be to let it be weather. He thought about Irene Hobbs patting his hand in the common room and hoping the land was all right. He thought about a watch running for 5 years in a hollow tree. "Patricia," he said, "if I made a call tomorrow to the state attorney general's office, would you talk to them?" The silence this time was different from all the others, shorter, like a decision that had been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right question. "Yes," she said. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that for 10 years. Dale pulled the padded envelope toward him and held it in his hand. Then he set it back on the table. He picked up a pen and wrote on the back of the envelope a single name and a number he pulled from the directory in the kitchen drawer. "Iowa Attorney General, Criminal Division." "Can I call you back in the morning?" he said. "I'll be here," Patricia said. He thanked her and hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a long time, not moving, the envelope in one hand and the pen in the other, the watch in its felt box open on the table in front of him. The second hand moved. The decision, when it finally settled, didn't feel like courage. It felt like the end of something that had been exhausting him for 2 weeks without his fully admitting it. A weight he'd been carrying at an angle, pretending it wasn't there, and now he'd set it down and could feel exactly how heavy it had been. He put the pen down. He went to bed. In the morning, he made one phone call before he left the house. The federal courthouse in Cedar Rapids was 90 miles from Nevada, and Dale drove it 11 times. Once for the preliminary meeting with the prosecutor, once for the deposition, 9 times for the trial itself. He drove down in the morning and back in the evening, the same route each way, 2-lane to the interstate to the city, the corn stubble in the fields giving way to suburbs, giving way to the gray geometry of downtown. He drove a Ford this time, an older one he kept for long trips. He drank coffee from a thermos. He listened to the farm report on the AM dial the way he had every morning for 30 years. The trial lasted 11 days. Susan Park was the lead prosecutor. She was methodical in the way that good prosecutors are methodical. Not showy, not theatrical, just precise. She built the case the way a person builds a fence, post by post, each piece set firmly before the next one was started. She called 17 witnesses over 9 days. Marcus Hobbs flew in from Missouri. He wore a dark suit that didn't quite fit him, the shoulders a little wide, the sleeves a little long. The suit of a man who didn't own many suits. He testified for 2 hours. He described the farm. He described growing up on it, the particular education of a boy raised on 800 acres, the names of the fields his grandfather had given them, the river ground, the North 40, the Oak Piece. He described his grandfather approaching him the morning they left, handing him the pocket watch, telling him to put it somewhere safe, somewhere only the land itself would keep it. He described leaving Iowa. He described the phone calls every week to his grandmother, the calls that got harder each year to end because ending them meant going back to a life that had no gravity anymore, no center. A loan officer from First Agricultural Bank testified under subpoena. His name was Gerald Whitfield, and he had worked in the lending division for 22 years. He testified that in September 2019, he had been told by Kramer to flag the Hobbs loan file for review and to note that a secondary lien concern had been raised internally. Whitfield said he had not seen documentation of any such concern. He said he had asked about it and had been told it was being handled at the senior level. Susan Park asked him why he hadn't pushed back. Gerald Whitfield looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, "Because Ernest Kramer had been his supervisor for 11 years, and you didn't push back on Ernest Kramer." Patricia Graves took the stand on day 7. She was 50 years old and looked older. On the stand, she described everything. She described the meeting with Kramer in his office in August 2019. She described the request, what he'd asked her to sign, how he'd framed it. She described his exact words, which she had written in a journal that same evening, and which she had read from every year since, on the anniversary of the day she signed the form, as a kind of self-imposed accounting. Kramer had told her the farm would be better used. He had told her that Joe Hobbs was 74 years old and had no succession plan. He had told her she was not causing harm, just helping a transition that would have happened eventually regardless. She described the $50,000, how it had arrived, how she had spent it in less than 3 months, as though spending it faster would dilute what it meant. She described sending the letter to Irene Hobbs after Joe died. She said she hadn't been able to name what she'd done, she hadn't had the courage for that, but she had needed Irene to know that someone was sorry. She cried twice during her testimony. The defense attorney, in cross-examination, suggested that Patricia had fabricated the arrangement with Kramer to reduce her own criminal exposure. Patricia looked at him steadily and said, "I am the criminal exposure. I signed a false document. I took a bribe. There is no version of my testimony that helps me." Dale took the stand on day 9. He described finding the watch, the hollow oak tree, the impossible ticking, the engraving. He placed the watch on the railing of the witness box, Harmon's felt box, the case open, the hands moving. And he told the jury that Joe Hobbs had hidden it deliberately, that a man in his 70s, on the last day he would ever stand on his own land, had taken the time to climb an oak tree and hide something for someone else to find. He said that told you something about the kind of man Joe Hobbs was. He said it told you something about what had been taken from him. Then Dale said the part that was harder. He said he had conducted the October 2020 auction. He said the process had moved faster than most foreclosures he'd been part of, and that he had noticed that, and that he had not investigated it. He said he had earned a commission of $48,600 on the sale. He said he had cashed the check and asked no questions, and that he had spent the years since then not thinking about it, which was its own kind of answer. The defense attorney rose and suggested that Dale's testimony was motivated by guilt. Dale looked at him. "I'm motivated by a pocket watch that ran for 5 years in an oak tree," he said. That's the thing I couldn't explain away. Kramer was present every day. He was brought in a wheelchair by his attorney and a care attendant. He wore a suit each day. His wife Margaret sat in the gallery behind him. She was there every session. On the days when testimony went late, she brought a thermos of coffee and 2 cups. Kramer did not testify. Once, during a recess, Dale passed close to Kramer's chair in the aisle. Kramer looked up at him. Dale stopped. They looked at each other for a moment. Neither spoke. Kramer looked away first. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned a verdict before dinner on day 11. Guilty on fraud. Guilty on mail fraud. Guilty on conspiracy to commit bank fraud. The judge sentenced Kramer to 8 years in federal prison, to be served in a facility equipped for his medical needs. The defense requested a stay pending appeal. The judge denied it. Margaret Kramer wept quietly in the gallery. Kramer himself showed no reaction. He sat in his chair with his hands in his lap and looked at the bench, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it. Outside the courthouse, the air was cold, and the afternoon light was flat and gray. Dale stood on the steps and buttoned his coat. He heard his name. Marcus was coming down the steps toward him, the ill-fitting suit, his eyes red. He stopped in front of Dale, and for a moment didn't say anything. And then he put his arms around him, a full embrace, the kind that happens when 2 people have been carrying the same weight from different ends for a long time. Dale stood there and let it happen. When Marcus stepped back, his face was wet. He said, "My grandfather died 3 years ago. I need you to know that I think he's at peace." Dale nodded. "I got a call this morning," Marcus said, "from my mother's lawyer. She's eligible for restitution. The full amount, land loss, medical, legal fees, everything." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "She won't have to count out her own toilet paper anymore." Dale looked at him. "My grandfather's watch found you," Marcus said, "as much as you found it." Dale didn't have an answer for that. He looked out at the parking lot, at the gray city, at the flat Iowa sky above it. "Drive safe," he said finally. Marcus nodded. He turned and walked toward a rental car parked at the curb. Dale watched him go. He stood on the courthouse steps alone for a while. The cold came through his coat after a few minutes, and he went to find his truck. 6 months after the verdict, Dale lost 4 clients, not all at once. One called in February to say he'd decided to go with someone else for the spring dispersal. No explanation, just a short call, professional and final. 2 others let their contracts lapse without renewal. The 4th was direct about it. A farmer named Tennant, who had known Kramer since the 1980s, who called Dale on a Tuesday morning and said he appreciated Dale's work over the years but didn't feel comfortable continuing the relationship. Dale thanked him. He meant it. He preferred the directness. He did not explain himself to anyone who hadn't asked. The thing that surprised him was what came in from the other direction. The first call was from a woman in Boone County, 63 years old, had lost her farm in 2018 through a foreclosure she'd never believed was legitimate. Her name was Donna Schreiber, and she'd read about the Hobbs case in the Des Moines Register and called Dale's office number from the phone book. She spoke for 20 minutes about what had happened to her, the details different from Joe Hobbs's story, but the shape of it familiar. A loan called in suddenly, paperwork that moved faster than it should have, a sale price that fell short of what the land was worth. Dale listened. He asked questions. He wrote down names and dates on his legal pad. He called a lawyer he'd gotten to know through the Hobbs case, a woman in Ames who specialized in agricultural lending disputes, and gave her Donna Schreiber's number. After that, the calls came in steadily. Not a flood. 3 or 4 a month, sometimes more. Farmers and farm widows from across Iowa and into Nebraska and Minnesota, people who had been carrying suspicion about their own foreclosures for years without knowing who to bring it to. Dale learned to tell the difference between a case with merit and grief looking for a cause. When a case seemed solid, he connected the family to the lawyer in Ames. When it didn't, he said so plainly and wished them well. He established a small fund. He put in $10,000 of his own money and wrote letters to 3 agricultural advocacy organizations who matched it. The fund paid legal consultation fees for families who couldn't afford the initial review. He did not name the fund after himself or anyone else. Patricia Graves had pled guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for her cooperation and testimony. She had moved back to her hometown of Marshalltown and was working as a bookkeeper for a farm supply cooperative. On the side, she had begun speaking at agricultural lending conferences about the warning signs of predatory foreclosure practice. She was precise and unsentimental about her own role in what had happened. She described her actions without minimizing them. She said she had been afraid and that fear had made her complicit, and that these 2 things were both true and neither one excused the other. The Hobbs farm was returned to the family as part of the civil settlement. Marcus and his wife and their 2 children drove up from Missouri in late April, when the fields were soft and the willows along the creek were just coming green. The farmhouse needed work. The barn needed more. The oak shelter belts along the fence lines had gaps from a 2022 storm that hadn't been replanted. Marcus walked the property for the first time in 5 years and called Dale from the middle of the north field. He didn't say much. Dale could hear the wind in the receiver and in the background, faintly, his children's voices. "We're coming back," Marcus said. "We're going to fix it up." Dale said that was good to hear. Irene was no longer in the Meadowbrook facility. Marcus had rented a small farmhouse outside of Nevada, a white house with a green roof and a south-facing yard. She had moved in on a Thursday in March, and by Saturday she had turned the south-facing yard into the beginning of a garden. Tomatoes along the fence, pole beans on a trellis Marcus built from old lumber, a row of butternut squash that spread further than she'd planned, the way it always had. Marcus's children came to help her after school on Fridays. She taught the older one, a girl of 9, how to read the soil with her hands, pressing it between her fingers to feel its moisture and composition, the way her own father had taught her 60 years ago on a farm that no longer existed in a part of Iowa that had long since become something else. She told the girl, "The land remembers. Even when people forget, the land remembers." In July, a package arrived at Dale's office. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a photograph, black and white, 5 inches by 7. It showed 2 people standing in front of a farmhouse, a young man and a young woman, the woman visibly pregnant, both of them squinting slightly into what must have been summer sun. Behind them, unmistakably, was the oak tree. It was smaller in the photograph, 50 years younger, its canopy less wide, its trunk thinner. But the shape was the same. The angle of the major branches, the particular way it stood at the corner of the barnyard, as though it had grown there on purpose. The young man was holding a pocket watch. He held it loosely at his side, not displaying it, just holding it the way a person holds something they carry as a matter of habit. He was looking at the camera with an expression that Dale studied for a long time before he found the word for it. Not happiness exactly, something quieter. The expression of a man who knows where he is and believes he will be there for a long time. On the back, in pencil, faded but readable, Joe and Irene, Hobbs Farm, first day, 1962. There was a note with the photograph on a half sheet of plain paper in Marcus's handwriting. "Grandfather wanted you to have this. He used to say that people who are good at seeing details eventually see the whole truth." He believed that. He hid the watch where someone careful would find it, and he was right. Thank you for being that person. Dale read the note twice. He set it on the desk beside the photograph. He looked at the photograph for a while, at Joe Hobbs, young and certain, the oak tree behind him, the watch in his hand, the whole future still intact. Then he picked up his clipboard and went to work. The judge read the verdict at 4:47 in the afternoon. The courtroom was not full. These things rarely are, at the end. The press had filed their stories. The curious had moved on to other curiosities, and what remained were the people who had been there every day because they had no choice but to be there. Marcus and his wife in the 3rd row, Margaret Kramer in the gallery behind her husband's wheelchair, the prosecutors at their table, still and professional. Dale in the back, his coat folded across his knees. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The judge spoke for 11 minutes after the verdict, about the nature of the crime, about the position of trust that had been violated, about the particular damage done when institutions meant to serve rural communities are turned against them. Kramer was remanded immediately. Margaret Kramer reached for her husband's hand as the attendant began to wheel him toward the door. Kramer let her take it. He did not look back at the courtroom. He looked at the door ahead of him and went through it. Dale watched him go. Justice, he thought, was not a moment of triumph. It was the restoration of something that should never have been stolen, and even that restoration was incomplete, because Joe Hobbs was dead, and the years Marcus had spent away from Iowa could not be returned, and Irene had lost a decade of her garden. The verdict fixed what it could fix. The rest would have to be carried. He put on his coat and walked out into the evening. On a Wednesday in late August, Irene Hobbs sat on the porch of the White House outside Nevada and watched her granddaughter water the tomatoes. The girl was 9 and serious about the work. She moved along the row with the watering can held in both hands, tipping it carefully at the base of each plant the way Irene had showed her. Not on the leaves, always at the root. She counted the plants under her breath as she went. The squash had spread beyond the trellis again this year. It always did. Irene had stopped being surprised by it and started being pleased, the way you make peace with the things that insist on growing past their boundaries. The restitution checks came on the 15th of each month. Irene did not think about them much. She had stopped calculating. That was the thing she noticed most, that she had stopped doing the arithmetic in her head, the constant subtraction that had been her companion for a decade. Every purchase had been a calculation before, the cost of this against the cost of that, whether she could manage, what she would have to give up. That arithmetic had run underneath every conversation and every night's sleep and every phone call with Marcus. A low hum of scarcity she had grown so accustomed to, she'd stopped hearing it as unusual. Now it was quiet. The girl finished the tomatoes and looked up. "All done," she said. "Good," Irene said. "Come sit with me." The girl came and sat on the step at Irene's feet, and they watched the fields together in the long, late summer light, the two of them, 4 generations between them, the land green and quiet in every direction. Dale drove out to the Hobbs farm on a Saturday in November. He hadn't called Marcus. He wasn't sure why he'd come exactly, not to see anyone, not to mark anything formally, just to be there. Just to stand in the place where it had started and see what it looked like now that the story had an end. He parked the Silverado on the gravel near the barn and walked around to the back. The oak tree stood where it had always stood. It was bare now, the way it had been the morning he'd found the watch. The branches black against a white sky, the canopy spread wide, the trunk massive and unhurried. The wound on the south side was still there, the hollow still open. Someone had cleared the old nesting material out over the summer. The cavity was empty now and clean. Dale stopped beneath the tree. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the photograph. Joe and Irene, 1962, the tree behind them younger and the future still intact. He held it in both hands and looked at it, then looked up at the tree, then back at the photograph. The same tree, 60 years apart. The wind came across the field from the north, the kind of wind that carries the smell of frozen ground and distance. The branches moved in it, creaking softly. The sound they make in winter when all the leaves are gone and there is nothing left to soften the motion. Dale stood there. He did not move for a long time. He was thinking about Joe Hobbs climbing this tree on the last day he would ever stand on his own land, at 74 years old, with a pocket watch meant for his grandson, hiding it where the right person might someday find it. Believing that person would come, believing even then that the truth could survive in a hollow tree if you put it somewhere careful. He was thinking about what it cost to believe that, what kind of man it required. He put the photograph back in his pocket. The wind went through the branches again. The tree held. Dale stood beneath it a while longer, still and unhurried, A man who had done the right thing late and knew the difference between that and doing it well, and was learning, slowly, to carry both. Then he walked back to his truck and drove home through the empty fields.